Right. Hello. Thank you for coming for today's talk, which is Thakumar Jhuli, the ghost stories of Bengali folklore. And I've put some trigger warnings in there just for you to quickly read in case anything is important. Um, Now, just by saying the phrase Thakumar Jhuli, I know that would have evoked a strong sense of nostalgia for at least a few attendees. And that's how powerful this concept has on pretty large community in India. So what is Thakumar Jhuli? As a literal translation, it means grandmother's satchel or grandmother's bag. A jhuli is sort of a bag that you make using a cloth and you tie it up and you make a bag. And the name comes from a collection of Bengali folk tales published in 1907 that is called Thakumar Jhuli. But just the words don't mean much, because what's potent about this is the image of a certain narrative practice that these words evoke. So I'm going to start by trying to evoke an image in your minds. Just follow along, even if it's very unfamiliar to you, and we'll try. So it's the beginning of the monsoon season, and your school's summer holidays have just begun. It's that time of the year when it's starting to get warmer, but the rains keep the temperature down. It's late afternoon, you've gone out to play with your friends in the neighborhood park. You can smell the rain-soaked earth, and you have goosebumps because you can hear the thunder, and you can feel the damp breeze on your face as you play. You're all out of breath and the sun starts to set, you and your friends head back to your place. You enter your house's courtyard, which looks like this, and you gather around the large banyan tree in the center. Your mother hands out glasses of cool iced tea, and you press the steel glass to your forehead and to your cheek, which is warm, and your grandmother slowly walks in and sits down under the banyan tree, surrounded by all the children facing her. She's carrying a satchel, and from it she fishes out yellowing old sheets of paper with text on it. She sifts through them for a minute and then holds one up against the sort of dying light of dusk and she begins to tell a story. The image that I just narrated might seem vaguely familiar to some and completely alien to others, but the truth is, it's highly unlikely that anyone will have this exact memory. And that is because what I just narrated is an amalgamation. It's sort of a mishmash of various archetypes of narrative practices that are prevalent in India. So from puppetry to shadow storytelling to music to theater artists to parents and grandparents telling us bedtime stories, oral culture and storytelling is foundational to the paradigm of Indian folklore. And these stories reflect the narrative practice that is used in disseminating them. So, just because the narrative practice is often an amalgamation of different techniques, the stories themselves are also a mishmash of various stories that you've heard. So they change every time the story is told. So I mean, for example, if my grandmother is telling me a story from one of an old story that she's heard before, and I haven't fallen asleep by the time the story's ended, she'll have to keep the story going. So she might smoothly segue into a different story, or she might have to make things up to keep going. And just by doing that, she's creating a new story. And that's how oral culture will work. Within Bengali culture specifically, there's a very rich repository of ghost or bhoot stories and ghostly archetypes that are prevalent in stories, film, song, and various forms of media. And today I'll attempt to summarize the joy that is Bengali ghost stories in around 45 minutes. The ever evolving and protean nature of these stories makes it very difficult to study it and even harder to encapsulate it in a talk, but I will do my best to give you at least a glimpse today of what it is and why it matters. Just for a structure, so you know what to expect, I will begin by giving you some historical context. What is Thakumar Jhuli? Why is it so important? And what it means in the context of the times in which it was published. Then I'll go through some of the archetypes and legendary folktales that occur frequently in Bengali culture, and I will talk a bit about how they have responded to the changing zeitgeist, to the changing spirit of the age over centuries. Next, I'll quickly discuss how Indian European entanglements have impacted these archetypes and perception of ghosts and fear around the colonial period and beyond. And finally, I'll touch upon some critical themes that are sort of actualized, literalized through these ghost stories, and then they're dealt with and they're negotiated using the afterlives of these ghost stories. And for that, I'll present some case studies. I'll start with the conception of the monstrous body and monstrosity through stories of Imdadul Haq Milon and the Thakumar Jhuli TV series. Next, I'll talk about Rabindranath Tagore's ghost stories and how they literalized the tensions between the Bengali middle class interior and exterior setting. Then I'll talk about the wonderful and 10 on 10 recommended film Bhuter Bhavishot, which translates to the future of ghosts and how it expresses anxieties regarding cultural memory. And finally, I'll finish with how later movies like Pari and Bulbul are reimagining Bengali ghosts to destabilize gendered narratives and gendered epistemologies of power within the cultural consciousness of the entire community. What I want to make absolutely clear, though, is that unlike the Gothic mode, Bengali ghosts don't all evoke fear. So they're not a motif, they're not a genre, it's not a method. They don't signify one thing. And they're not supposed to cause discomfort. In fact, Bengali ghosts can generate a space of comfort for many. They do for me, and they can also catalyze a re examination of sorts. Ghost stories are basically a living, breathing archive, an incredibly generative archive of experiences, beliefs, and of imaginations. So, for historical contexts, folk tales in general are often powerful tools of the construction of a national consciousness, and so they simultaneously hold the potential for the change and altering the national consciousness by creating an alternate sort of pseudo national identity. So our long colonial past has quite predictably tried to suppress our powerful folk tales and the allegories that hid the potential for uprisings and for national changes. So even before Thakumar Jhuli, there were epics, there were songs and stories, and not all Bengali ghosts come from Thakumar Jhuli. Some come from religious scriptures, some are European imports from the English translations of German, Norse, and Icelandic fairy tales, and some come to be during the colonial period as a result of colonial violence, and some are even urban legends. Folk tales were often used to pass messages between rebellious groups during the freedom struggle to forge a sense of self at a time when India was going through a rapid denativization and during industrialization. And what I mean by that is the East India Company were rewarding Bengali upper middle class men who dressed, spoke, and behaved like them through positions in mid level administration and through the feudal system of land ownership. These are some cartoons, comics that were made at the time. These men were called Babus, and the rise of Babu culture was synonymous with pretty much an attack on indigenous culture. So the good English novels that were part of the colonial curriculum and were entrusted with creating an Indian who was English in taste, in opinions, in morals, in intellect, were in practice not actually the novels that were sought out by the general Indian readers for leisure reading. The canon of popular literature and the books that were most avidly and spontaneously consumed by the Indian readers they were getting increasingly different from what was prescribed by the British public and read by the British public, within schools and within the general community. For example, so Priya Joshi, who's a scholar of post-colonial Gothic, also documents that Gothic melodrama, sensational fiction, all of this, it found an enthusiastic and continuing market among colonial readers. And that includes British administrators in India as well as a large Indian population. So the literary markets of India were being exposed to these European imports. And with the advent of the printing press, cheap Gothic blue books that were these sort of chap books, 36 or 72 pages, were circulating in India. And the sheer volume of literature coming into the market overwhelmed the proliferation of oral culture. As bedtime stories shifted from stories passed down through generations towards a Gothic tale that was printed in 36 pages, there was this collective anxiety within the literati of Bengal that the folk tales would be completely lost to time and no one would pass them on to kids and they wouldn't survive. In light of this, the first textual documentations of folklore were written during this moment of crisis as attempts at overwriting the overwhelming European influence on Bengali literary sort of marketplaces. This is the Folktales of Bengal, which was published in 1883 by Lal Bihari Dey, and this was, in essence, pretty much the same archetypal stories that you'll see later in Thakumar Jhuli and that were seen in folklore. But this anthology did not garner as much attention because, firstly, it was written in English. And in addition to the obvious loss of meaning that comes with translation, this publication was aimed at opening up our rich folklore to a wider European English speaking audience, to a British consumer, as opposed to championing it in local contexts. And secondly, it chose to omit the frame narrative of the grandmother that I told you about, and the story of the Thakumar and her Jhuli, and without that it loses a lot of its power, it loses the narrative practice. And then we come to Thakumar Jhuli, which was anthologized by Dakkinaranjan Mitra Mojumdar in 1907 in the backdrop of the first Swadeshi movement in Bengal. The first Swadeshi movement was from 1850 to around 1918, and it was a self-sufficiency movement as part of the broader freedom struggle. And it began with a boycott of imported products. So it moved towards self-reliance and independence. So we will make our own fabric, we will grow our own crops, and we will read our own literature. In fact, Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Nobel laureate, writes in this introduction to Thakumar Jhuli, is there any other piece of literature that is of such national importance as Thakumar Jhuli? In today's age, the European fairy tales threaten to become the only mode for our children. So you can see the anxiety that led to the production of this book. Originally containing 12 stories, Thakumar Jhuli featured ghosts, deities, princes and princesses, monsters, and talking animals, and the collection became supremely popular and widely read, and is now regarded as the first textualization of Bengali folklore. Iterations and editions of these stories are still narrated and told, often with one story seamlessly going into another, but even now, if a Bengali grandmother or grandfather tells you a ghost story, she will credit it to the Kinaranjan Mitra Majumdar's Thakumar Jhuli. And let me tell you some of the ghost stories and some of the ghosts that you will meet if you start reading one of these books. One of the ghosts that you will come across is the Shakchundi. Now, the Shakchuni is the ghost of a married woman, typically a newly married woman, who presumably died due to a violent marriage or due to the consequences of a bad marriage. And in the afterlife, she basically has never experienced domestic bliss and is what she craves for. She dwells in a shaura tree, which is a form of an asper tree, and watches as people walk by, as newlyweds walk by, and she wishes that someone would marry her and someone would love her. In this story in Thakumar Jhuli, she is green for some reason, and she shape shifts into a newlywed's mother-in-law to lead the bride astray into an abandoned, sort of secluded area of a forest, where using her powers, she captures the bride, putting her in a state of hibernation and hiding her in a crevice in her shaura tree. Then she assumes the form of the bride and she goes to her home. Once in the home, however, once she's gotten inside, she does nothing. She attempts to harm nobody and she spends her day doing domestic chores. When she's discovered to be a ghost, she's beaten out of the house with a shoe and forced to promise never to enter the house of an upper caste family again. So it doesn't end very well for the Shakchundi in this case. Another form of ghost is the Petni. Petnis are ghosts of a widowed or unmarried woman who presumably didn't receive proper cremation burial rites when she died, and and that might be because, and probably is because of the taboo around widowhood and unmarried, and basically independent women not tied to a man or to a family in 18th and 19th century Bengal, and they're supposed to be fearsome ghosts. But their motivation again is love and desire. They enchant men without causing any harm, unless, of course, he mistreats her, in which case that's punishable by death, by a gruesome death. So it goes from 0 to 100 really fast. But Petnis are punished in death too. Anything they eat turns to fire in their bellies, And if they wear any fine fabric like silk or muslin, these clothes become scalding hot sheets of iron. And as a result, they're often represented as naked and malnourished or skeletal. My point here is that for the longest time in Bengali ghost lore, the fearsome archetypes were ghosts of people who did not belong in life, in society, and continued to be unwelcome in the home upon death as well. So in death, they just wanted to love and be loved, and they wanted to belong, and only turning violent if someone threatened to hurt them, but never as a means to an end. Moving on, we have characters like the Rakhoshi. Rakhoshi Rani means demon queen, and the villainy of a lot of women characters is usually associated with in the independent woman's unnatural and violent and sometimes hysteric sexuality, as described. And Thakumar Jhuli is unlike a lot of other mainstream folk tales where the Rakhoshi Rani becomes a femme fatale, and the Rakosh in most stories usually marries the king or the emperor of a kingdom and builds familial relationship with him, and sometimes even conceives his child, only to then start devouring the cattle or horses or even humans, and destroying and trying to destroy the kingdom entirely. In the male-dominated structure of most folklores, Rakhoshi Rani is an epitome of almost infinite power. She challenges the masculine concepts of courage and valor, creating a space for herself which is feared by men. Her appearance is of dual nature, so she can shapeshift. She can become an enigmatic and attractive sort of human looking form, and then she can change into this threatening and fearsome Rakhoshi. Her roles as both the seductress and the villain are explored literally by giving her two different forms, both starkly different from one another, to serve her purposes of attracting and then oppressing. Now, these are just the many archetypes of Bengali ghosts. There's Dakini, Jogini, river spirits, tree spirits, and I won't go any further into the typology, but there are many great resources if you're interested. And one of them right on the screen here is this book by Rakesh Khanna and J. Philosopher Bhairav. And this is basically a catalog of hundreds of different kinds of folkloric ghosts from all across India, just not just Bengal. And of course, it's not comprehensive, and it can't be for something like this because it's changing as we speak every time someone narrates it again. But it is definitely a great place to start if you're interested. Going back to Thakumar Jhuli, though, many of these archetypes come solely from this text. And what I mean is, if I say that the Shakchunni lives in a Shara tree, it's because that in this one story in the Thakumar Jhuli, the Shakchunni was told to be living in a Shara tree, and that's just become the lore now. Similarly, if the Rakhoshi can shapeshift, it's because she did in this one story. So this text became set a precedent for an entirety of ghost lore. And even though now we have come a long way from Thakumar Jhuli, all roads lead back to it, as it were. To appreciate the distinctiveness of Bengali ghost stories, it is helpful to consider them alongside European Gothic narratives. The Gothic, which emerged in Europe in the late 18th century, Gothic literature did. If you think about Castle of Otranto being the first Gothic novel, it emphasizes horror, sort of atmospheric horror, and the idea of the uncanny. And European Gothic often frames supernatural entities as abstract motifs or metaphors for moral and psychological anxieties. You see haunted castles, foggy moors, and spectral apparitions, which serve as allegories of repression, fear, the uncanny, but they rarely operate as agents embedded within a social or communal network. Bengali ghosts, on the other hand, are sort of thoroughly social creatures. They emerge from specific cultural, geographic, and historical contexts. They eat, they sleep, they cry, they play. So these ghosts are not just Gothic motifs, they're embodiments of a lived social experience, of encoded memory, and of a moral pedagogy. Their actions are deeply rational, relational. They're ghostly beings whose power is measured not just by the ability to frighten. In fact, it's almost never measured by their ability to frighten, but their capacity to intervene and meddle in everyday life. So, European ghosts are, like I said, they frequently reflect psychological and existential anxieties. If you think of Shakespeare's ghosts like Hamlet's father or the phantoms in Anne Radcliffe's novel, they try to revenge. unfinished business, or secrets, and their presence is often fleeting or symbolic. Bengali ghosts, by contrast, operate within a communal imagination. They're tied to specific places like a pond or a banyan tree or a deserted path, and so they reinforce a moral collective consciousness. A tale like the Shakchunni haunting her relatives is not just about horror, it also reflects social injunctions regarding marriage, fidelity, and propriety. So in this sense, Bengali ghosts are created created often based on how they died, but their purpose as a ghost is no longer tied to the incident of their death. They will eat, they will sleep, they will pull pranks, they'll hold grudges, and they love, and they're pretty much like real people that have been othered in society due to circumstance. Moreover, sort of really interestingly, Bengali ghosts are highly mutable. Their characteristics, their appearances, they change according to who's telling the story, and they reflect, like I said, this mishmash of oral practices. So, a Shakchunni, you can see, has been shown to be green in color. She can be completely white or black. She can be look completely like a human. She sometimes the Petni is skeletal. Sometimes she wears a sari. Sometimes she just looks like a sheet of cloth. European Gothic, in contrast, privileges textual stability. So the terror of the castle, the ghastly apparition, or the haunted mansion is codified in a written form and rarely and very rarely evolves beyond a symbolic function. So this protean quality of Bengali ghosts underscores a broader epistemology, which is that the supernatural is not a fixed category. It's a site for negotiation, commentary, and communal imagination. So, depending on what you want to say, the story changes and the ghost changes. Now, I've created this very neat binary here. And the fact is that this binary that I have before you is complete nonsense. Like most seemingly watertight categories, colonial encounters have had a significant role in shaping our narratives as well. So, European Gothic texts were widely circulated in Bengal through colonial print networks, like I told you. But Bengali folklore did not merely imitate European Gothic, it engaged with it, it resisted it, and it often localized and contextualized it. Ghosts rarely sort of they rarely became completely a European Gothic motif. But even if they were, even if they had haunted houses, sort of spectral revenge, or if they were vampires, they would appear in Bengali narratives with adaptations to reflect the cultural anxieties of Bengal. For example, shape-shifting or seductive ghosts may echo Gothic seduction tropes, but in Bengali tales, they're also deeply entangled with issues of kinship, of marriage, and of ritual propriety. So, in short, ghosts are relational. They're performative. Bengali ghosts are relational. They're performative. They're mutable, and they're socially embedded. They're ethical agents. They're cultural critics and active participants in the community. And by examining these differences, we begin to see why Bengali ghost stories just cannot be reduced to a mere Gothic adaptation. It does not come within the Gothic imagination. It functions in completely different ways and it needs its own critical vocabulary and framing. So just because they're ghosts doesn't make it Gothic at all. Coming to the case studies, I'll start with talking about the afterlives of Thakumar Jhuli. Apologies in advance for what's going to be a very confusing timeline, but in all honesty, the development of this genre does not follow a linear narrative, so it's best to approach this thematically. Disability has been a metaphorical trope in dominant forms of cultural production, sadly, where the disabled self is often used as a metaphor for cultural discourses of lack, of tragedy, and of the flawed. And like I said, the ghosts are etched into the very script of Bengali culture. So when we find them appearing in various forms of media, these ghosts exist in relation to, to contemporary society. And the use of bodily monstrosity is used to differentiate these entities from the living. Tropes such as sometimes ghosts can rotate their heads 360 degrees, or they can extend their limbs beyond human capabilities. They can dismember parts of their bodies, they can shrink to become tiny, or they can extend their limbs, extend their bodies completely. But often these ghosts aren't used to other them. They're not about making them fearsome or evil or conceived in a manner which seems disfigured, it's referred to as a trait of the ghost. So between 2003 and 2005, a tech company in India called Dawson Tech, based in Kolkata, ran the series for children called Thakumar Jhuli. And as a matter of fact, many people from my generation will think about this series, this show, when we talk about Thakumar Jhuli. Take a look at this next clip that I'm going to show you from the Shark Chunni episode. Don't worry about what they're saying, it's in Bengali, but notice the visuals and the expressions.
বৌমা রান্নাঘরে তোর সাথে কথা আছে।
কি কথা? এইবারে বুঝলাম, এ তোমার বৌমা নয়, আসলে শাঁকচুন্নি। ও ও নিশ্চিত তোমার বৌমাকে ওই শ্যাওড়া গাছে লুকিয়ে রেখেছে, তাই ঘরে ফেরার পথ।
লেবু হলে লেবু খাবেন না? দাঁড়ান, আমি এক্ষুনি এনে দিচ্ছি। হায় ভগবান, এ কি অলক্ষণে কাণ্ড!
So you can see that when the mother-in-law saw her using her feet as kindling or extending her arm, the feeling of shock came from the fact that a stranger has infiltrated her home and not fear or disgust of a ghost. Physical differences did not signify a lack as much as they represent the failure of society to integrate differences under one roof. This corresponds with the discourse around disability in colonial Bengal, which treated it as something infectious, as something contagious, and something that simply just should not be in the household. In later years, despite ghosts becoming synonymous with fear, physical otherness was still never used as a catalyzer, sort of a catalyst for fear. Imdadul Haq Milan is a Bangladeshi author who published numerous collections of ghost stories in the late 20th century. In his stories, the monstrous body was given agency, and the distinction was not used to other these characters. His ghosts may still have disfigured limbs, or distorted faces, or scarred features, but these physical markers signal social and moral deviance, but they also mark the persistence of memory, of trauma, and injustice. Moving on to sort of ghostly interiors and exteriors, Rabindranath Tagore was a Bengali polymath and a writer during the Bengal Renaissance. And in 1913, he became the second non European ever to win a Nobel Prize in any category. He won it for literature. And Tagore was the first to create a string of extremely successful and atmospheric Gothic short stories. The most famous of them you can see on the screen right now was Monihara and Khudito Pasha, which were translated almost immediately and anthologized several times. Both of them embody almost all the classical features of a Victorian Gothic tale: large, brooding, almost sentient mansions, simmering and a displaced eroticism, and a deliberate psychologization of fear, and of course, the requisite unquiet, restless souls. The remarkable point of unity of all these stories, however, which sets them apart from pre-modern ghost stories, so the folk tales Thakumar Jhuli, is that the location of fear had shifted from trees, marshes, and ponds and was now the home. Monihara is the story of a lonely wife whose childless life is filled with a pathological attachment to her jewelry. She dies a lonely, violent death at the hands of a distant cousin who murders her on a stormy night for her jewels. But what is important for us today here is the role the domestic space plays in this haunting. The climactic point of the story is reached as Moni Mollika's dejected widower husband enters their deserted bedroom and proceeds to wait for his dead beloved. The following passage describes the bedroom in its minutest detail, carefully outlining and emphasizing the everyday, the sort of quotidian materiality of clothes racks, tea tables, empty soap boxes, and lamps, everything that Moni Mollika used to interact with and touch every day and now is left collecting dust. It's a very purposeful description because space plays a central part in this paragraph. I'll just quickly read this out for you. Even she who departs, leaving everything bare behind her, leaves so many signs, so much history, so much of her lively self, her careful touch. Come, Moni Mollika, come and light your lamp, light up your room, stand in front of the mirror and put on your sari with careful pleats. All your possessions are waiting for you. Spread your glory on all these scattered things with your life, yoke them together, and infuse them with life in turn. These inanimate things cry out mutely and making this very house a cremation ground. So it's not just the empty room, but the very hearth, the home of bourgeois selfhood that is rendered unstable here. Tagore's metaphor of the house as a cremation ground is quite potent because Moni Mollika's restless spirit is definitely not the Petni of folklore, and nor does she have behave like any of the pre-modern ghosts. What makes the dead Moni Mollika fearsome and scarier is that she brings the dark wilderness and the discomfort from the outside into the home. She makes the home, which is associated with life, into this dead space of a cremation ground. There's no longer any assurance that closed doors will keep the outside out and the dead will cross the threshold and contaminate the safety of the living. The shift came in a way that the ghost no longer wanted to enter home spaces and attempt societal reintegration, like we saw in the Chakchunni story, where she just wants to come and exist. These ghosts now work to either enter the home or draw them outside into their habitat and hurt them there. These ghosts are exhausted of asking for what is theirs. They fiercely protect their habitat out in the wilderness. They're angry, they're hateful, and they're tired of unbelonging. What happened to Bengali ghosts is what happens when something is refused entry into loving spaces for too long, when something is left out in the cold to freeze or in the rain to rot, when safety is revealed to be simply an ideology, and the objects that previously were markers of security, they themselves turn threatening. Moni Mollika's presence not only invades the home, pulling down partitions between private and public, it actually negates the home as ever being adequate habitat for the bourgeois self. Moving on to cultural memory and talking about bringing these ideas to a contemporary setting, we turn to Bhuter Bhobishot, a film by Onik Dotto that revitalizes Bengali ghostly archetypes while simultaneously offering a post colonial, utopian, and socially satirical lens. Unlike European Gothic or even unlike the colonial era print stories, the ghosts in Bhuter Bhobishot are fully integrated into a shared social space. Um, at the outset, Bhuter Bhobishot presents a dilapidated apartment building as a meeting ground for ghosts from different historical periods. The spatial conceit alone is significant. So, Bengali ghosts, whether from oral traditions of Thakumar Jhuli or the colonial print era, are always linked to specific locales, the banyan tree, the pond, or the deserted mansion. But by assembling these ghosts from different eras, the film highlights the diachronic nature of Bengali supernatural's imagination. Each ghost embodies the historical moment from which they hail. A zamindar's son, a colonial era writer, a modern city dweller, the building itself becomes a locus where memory, history, and social commentary converge. And hence, you can see why someone like me would leap at an opportunity to study a space where all of these ghosts they exist at the same time. The plot of the movie is simple. In the wake of rapid urbanization, old buildings are being razed, patches of trees are being deforested, rivers are drying up. And you probably understand now that this means that the Bengali ghosts are facing essentially a housing crisis. They all gather in this one colonial era derelict mansion to cohabitate, and what follows is a series of comedic misadventures. This film uses the spectrality of ghosts to tackle a variety of themes, but today the point is that the entire premise, as well as overarching plot of the film, presents as a metaphor for resisting cultural and historical erasure. The ghosts gather due to a loss of physical space, and the climax of the film comes as they try to resist the mansion being destroyed by a property developer who wants to make it into a shopping complex. But the ghosts here represent their moments of culture, and the film makes a compelling case for preserving historical culture at the cost of modernization and progress, not through violence, but through the collective power of voices that refuse to be forgotten. And in this way, the film reframes these ghost stories as a form of cultural activism almost, a reminder that traditions only survive when they are actively remembered, protected, and allowed to coexist with the present. Bengali ghost stories are also deeply intertwined with questions of gender. Female ghosts such as Shakchunni, Petni, and Rakhoshi, they embody traits that disrupt the patriarchal expectations of Bengali society. They're assertive, they're vengeful, they're independent, quality that, as you may have guessed, canonically are quoted as unnatural for women. And these spectral women illuminate a recurring tension, which is the cultural anxiety around women who deviate from domestic, nurturing, and submissive roles. The Rakhoshi Rani, which I spoke about, is an interesting sort of post-colonial character to look at. And we can see representation of them in Pari and in Bulbul. So I told you about the Rakhoshi Rani, which often becomes a cautionary tale because the story is often that this demon queen marries a king, and then after she's married the king, she's become the queen. Then she wreaks havoc in the kingdom, and it becomes a tale of, oh, you shouldn't fraternize with the enemy because if you do, then she will cause havoc. An alternate presentation of in folklore is of the infertile wife. Often it's the king who is unable to produce a child in spite of marrying several queens, and his prayers are only answered when he marries the Rakhoshi queen who's able to give him a child. If seven queens fail to reproduce any heir by one king, naturally the doubt falls upon the king, but the patriarchal structure happens to be very conveniently limiting our sights within this periphery. And it's implied that the problem is with all the women. Folktales are used to conceive women within this binary: the shy, reserved, beautiful, infertile wife, and this disfigured, frightening demon queen. But the Petni and the Rakhoshi in contemporary media has managed to completely turn this narrative on its head in films like Proshit Roy's Pari and Anvita Dutt's Bulbul, which are the two films you see on screen. Pari is the story of a daughter of a demon who was abused when she was abducted by a satanic cult in Bangladesh that aimed at perpetuating the bloodline of a demon. Basically, she meets this man who's kind and nice, and she falls in love with him and has a child, is pregnant. But at this point, he finds out that she's a demon, and he basically shuns until she finds a human nurse who helps her through the pregnancy and helps her deliver the child. In the end, she gives the child to the man and says, please raise this child as your own because it's not like me, meaning it's not a demon. And after she gives the child to him, she retreats into the forest, disappears off, and goes off to die, basically. And the main character story here is the story of every woman born into a history of intergenerational violence, chained for her own protection, and then transacted between men and abused by them, pushed to the margins of human society, and ultimately pushed to a self inflicted death. On the other hand, Bulbul is based in colonial Bengal and follows the story of a woman by the same name who was a victim of child marriage and subsequent abuse, and tells the story of how her metamorphosis into a Shakchunni catalyzes her freedom in an aristocratic family. Bulbul manages to reconstruct ideas of legality and of femininity and of sexual deviance and sexual desire in post-colonial Bengal. And it uses familiar tropes of South Asian women, which is the widow, the child, the bride, the goddess, and it puts all of this into one representation, which is Bulbul as a Shakchundi. Uh, they show how the film departs from legalistic models of justice and instead imagines a mythic, affective form of redress grounded in female desire, self assertion, and spectral agency. Bulbul transforms its protagonist from a victim of domestic and sexual abuse into a supernatural avenger whose power exposes the failure of social institutions to protect women. For the authors, the film's imagination of justice lies precisely in this shift. It legitimizes women's rage, reclaims pleasure and autonomy as political, and uses the supernatural to articulate forms of gendered justice that the real world continually withholds from them. To conclude, this brings me to the end of today's talk, and I've spoken about a lot today. And I know that there has been a bit of an information overload, but it hasn't felt like that to me because it's emotionally charged for me. I hope I've managed to establish that Bengali ghost stories are never just ghost stories. And I hope that this talk has raised more questions for you than it has answered, because the answers lie in these archives and these narratives. We love and we hate and we fear our ghosts, but we never wish to forget our ghosts because they hold emotional memory and cultural memory with the same ease. They carry folklore, trauma, humor, critique, protest, longing, love, and resistance. These ghosts inhabit forgotten spaces, and they occasionally jump out at us and remind us of important spaces, ideas, and people that might haunt us if we forget. The question of why this matters is not just theoretical. Across the centuries, their forms have changed, but their significance has not. Bengali ghosts survive by adapting, by shape-shifting, by refusing to remain static, much like the communities that have created them. And in a world where I think we'll all agree that cultural amnesia spreads incredibly quickly now, where modernity often demands forgetting, and where homogenizing narratives push against regional specificity, Bengali ghosts stand as a testament to cultural resilience. So when the next time you by any chance come across any of these ghost stories of Thakumar Jhuli, I hope that you fully feel the breadth, the volume, and the weight of memory, experiences, and beliefs that come with it. Thank you for joining in today. And here is a list of references and some recommended readings and watches. And thank you so much for listening.